Hey guys, in this video I'm going to be showing a water cooling build in the North case by Fractal Design, which I also have to thank them for because they did send me this unit to work on. In one of my past projects, I really enjoyed working on the torn case for a couple reasons. I really like the aesthetics of the case, but also because thermally it essentially functions like an open air. Although it is a closed case, the ventilation cutouts on the front and rear panels were made quite large where it was just so breathable. I was able to include a Ryzen 9 5900X and an RTX 3080 Ti in a single loop, being cooled off of just one 360mm radiator. In breathable cases like this, you can get away with using less cooling hardware even for some higher-end CPUs and graphics cards. Looking at the Fractal Design North, it's carried over that same breathable design, which is why I was excited to try the same thing as I did in the Torrent build and see if it holds up similar thermal performance. Except this time I have an Intel 13700K, which is more recent and runs a bit hotter than the 5900X, and an RTX 3080 Strix, which I will also include in a single loop with just one 360mm radiator. Now this system is made mostly for gaming, so the advantage of that is that the GPU will be doing most of the work, and it's going to have access to most of the radiator's cooling bandwidth to itself. When taking into account non-gaming applications or just a mix of workflows, there aren't many programs or games that will use both the CPU and GPU on full blast at the same time, which is why a solo decently thick 360mm radiator is going to be sufficient, and I will be providing some thermal numbers later in the video. As for the other core components that are going into the build, I'll be using an Asus ROG Strix Z790E gaming Wi-Fi motherboard, which was provided by Asus. I also have 32GB of DDR5 Dominator Platinum memory kit, which was provided by Corsair, and a 1TB Samsung 970 EVO of my own, which already has Windows 11 and all my games installed for testing. The RTX 3080 Strix by Asus is one of the spare GPUs I had, and it already has the EK Classic water block on it, so I figured it would pair well with the motherboard I'm using here. This graphics card was in one of my old gaming and editing rigs, and it's still a very relevant and powerful card in 2023, so not a bad idea to reuse it in a new build. The power supply is the Corsair RM850X, and the custom cables are from Mainframe Customs, which I had them made in black to fit the build theme. As for cooling hardware, I actually got sent the Uni 80 D5 pump res combo by Steelkey Customs to try out. Steelkey Customs is a small company based out in Germany that focuses on water cooling hardware, and they are making some really neat stuff like the cube tubes that you may have seen me use in some of my past builds. The rest of the cooling hardware will be from EK, such as the Velocity 2 CPU water block, the new Surface P360M radiator in black, which comes in at a nice thickness of 44mm, and all the fittings that I'll be using as well. Another sponsor of this build is from the Titan Rig team that graciously sent over some of the EK water cooling hardware you see in this video. All of the parts I use in this build will be linked in the description below. Normally, when it comes to hardware in general, I do like to match branding across the entire build for aesthetic purposes, such as using all EK, all Corsair, or all whatever brand. And as much as I would like to use all Steelkey Customs, they are limited on hardware and don't offer all the parts for a full system build. But those guys are really awesome and make cool stuff, so I wanted to stick that Uni 80 D5 pump res combo into the system and give them a shout out to show what they are capable of making as they grow. Another note about radiator clearance is that even using larger radiators like the Corsair XR7 or EK Surface X series, which are 10 to 14mm thicker than the EK Surface P series that I'm using in this build, will still fit in the front panel if you want. Now I am using 14mm tubing in this build, and I originally was going to go with either carbon fiber or copper, but at the last minute I decided to go with some basic clear acrylic tubes for a better aesthetic match. The reason being is because when you look at the Fractal Design North, this case already has 3 different colors to it. It's got a black frame as the base, wooden tone for the front panel, and gold accents on the buttons such as the front I/O and the case feed. Adding copper or carbon fiber would have been throwing more accents into the mix, and I just felt it was a bit much. As for the fans, I'm using one of my favorites, which are the Noctua NF812x25s, 3 of them on the radiator, which will be intake, and 2 mounted at the top of the case for exhaust. Now, building inside the North case, the first thing I do is remove the two hard drive cages to make more room because I don't plan on using them. On the front panel, I remove the default Fractal Design 140mm case fans because I plan on using 120mm fans instead. I have the radiator facing inward and the fans facing outwards for intake where the mounting frame is sandwiched between the two. When doing this method, you will have to hold the radiator in place with one hand while securing the screws through the fans on the front side. If you do plan on mounting a standard size 360mm radiator, like the one I have here on the front panel, I did run into a small fitment issue. The mounting slots on the bracket don't quite line up with the radiator's 120mm screw holes. The reason is because the PSU shroud that extends up to the front was cut in a way where it doesn't allow the radiator to shift into position where it needs to be. The workaround is you'd have to use one side of the 140mm slots by shifting the radiator all the way to the right in order to mount it. If I were to revise the Fractal Design North case to accommodate custom water cooling better, I would say just the PSU shroud needs to be trimmed a bit more on the inside so radiator placements have a better fitment. Just a quarter of an inch would be enough. Now, an easy DIY method you could do is just trim it down with a Dremel. And as for the motherboard, I've already prepared it in advance, which is a process most of you have probably already seen many times before, with installing the CPU, SSD, RAM sticks, and CPU water blocks, so we'll go right into installing it into the case. The neat thing about the rear panel of the North case is that the ventilation cutouts are spaced just right where you have the option to easily mount a common 120mm fan or pump res, or a pump res like the Uni 80 here that measures 105mm by 65mm on the mounting dimensions without any modifications. Not only that, but there is so much play here where you can fit mount your device by small increments with any of these holes, and this is very convenient for aligning certain fittings and tubes across two other components. Building the rest of the system is pretty straightforward, and I'm not doing a vertical GPU mount here, just keeping it horizontal and simple. Fittings and tube runs on this was pretty easy except one of the shorter tubes that goes from the pump res outlet into the CPU water block, which did take a bit of effort. Once the loop is completed and filled, cables all plugged in, it's time to run some tests and see how it does. Right now I do have XMP set for the RAM and the GPU is overclocked through the NVIDIA GeForce Experience program. Temperature wise, the GPU doesn't go past 61 or 62 degrees C when running the TimeSpy stress test for 20 loops. I do have a custom fan curve set up where the fans don't even need to do more than 50%, which comes out to just around 1200 RPM. That's why I really like the Noctua fans because even at 100%, which is around 2000 RPM, they still do a good job noise-wise. The only component I feel would make somewhat of any noticeable noise is the D5 pump, but normally with builds like this, I always set the pump to about 50%, which in the case was around 2400 RPM, and I couldn't even hear it, especially with the tempered glass panel on. So to reiterate the goal here, was I able to accomplish the thermal performances I was seeking in this build? And the answer is yes, to no surprise actually. In fact, I would even say that the thermal performances in the North case could be even better because there is still a lot more headroom in turning up the fans for both, that's referring to both the fan speed and also the noise level, and also incorporating a thicker sized radiator than what I used in here. This case by default I think goes very well with air coolers and AIO liquid coolers because of its compact ATX size nature. As for custom water cooling, I think there is plenty of room to work with, and the only improvement I could see was just trimming of the PSU shroud I mentioned earlier. I also have my personal list of favorite recommended coolers that would go well with this case down below, so be sure to check that out if you want. Another external feature I noticed is that the way the tempered glass panel is installed and taken off is quite nice and secure on the Fractal Design North. This is important because I've worked with a few other cases where handling the glass panel wasn't as intuitive and people were just dropping and breaking them simply because the design of taking them off and putting them back on the case wasn't done well. Aesthetically, I also think it's a great looking case with the wooden accent for those who are building their setup around a more earthy tone. it would probably go well with an IKEA walnut Carlby tabletop and some plants on the side or something. Let me know if this is a case you would use for your own rig down in the comments, and also what sort of parts you put in it. Okay, so that's all I have for this video. The Fractal Design North case is something that I can recommend for any type of cooling setup, and I really enjoyed working on this one, just like the Torrent case. But now I do have to move on to a couple other builds that are due at the end of this month. So thank you so much for watching. I appreciate your time. And as always, I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.